I sat in Busby's curse chair and I'm counting down the days. There are some stories that stick with you, no matter how old they are or how far removed they seem from your own life. For me, that story is the legend of Thomas Busby and his cursed chair. I first heard about it from a friend during a late-night discussion about cursed objects. We were swapping ghost stories, talking about things like Robert the Doll and the Hope Diamond, when my friend brought up Busby's stoop chair. At the time, I hadn't heard of it, but as soon as he started telling me the story, I was hooked. The tale goes back to the 18th century in Thirsk, North Yorkshire, England. Thomas Busby was a notorious criminal, a man with a reputation for drunkenness, violence, and a mean streak that seemed to run a mile wide. In 1702, Busby was sentenced to death for murdering his father-in-law, Daniel Auty, during a drunken argument. The story goes that Busby had caught Auty sitting in his favorite chair, a simple wooden chair in the inn Busby owned. Enraged by the sight, Busby attacked Auty and bludgeoned him to death. But it wasn't just the murder that made Busby infamous, it was the curse he left behind. Before his execution, Busby was allowed one last request, to have a final drink in his beloved chair. As he sat there, knowing his time was running out, he supposedly cursed the chair, vowing that anyone who sat in it would meet a swift and violent death. And according to the legend, his curse held true. Over the years, countless people who sat in Busby's chair reportedly died under strange or tragic circumstances. Accidents, sudden illnesses, fatal injuries, each one seemingly tied to the chair's dark curse. The chair became so infamous that the local museum eventually hung it high on the wall, out of reach, to prevent anyone else from tempting fate. Hearing the story sent a chill down my spine. I've always been fascinated by cursed objects, but something about this chair, a seemingly ordinary piece of furniture that could carry such a deadly weight, captivated me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and eventually, I decided I needed to see it for myself. As soon as I started researching Busby's stoop chair, I realized just how deep the legend ran. The chair wasn't just a passing ghost story. It had a track record of death that spanned centuries. Each tale I uncovered made the curse feel more real, more dangerous. And it wasn't long before I became obsessed with piecing together the timeline of the chair's victims. The earliest deaths associated with the chair were in the 19th century, more than 100 years after Busby's execution. The stories started with a handful of men who sat in the chair while drinking at the inn. Men who, within days, met grisly ends. Some were involved in accidents. Others died of sudden, unexplained illnesses. Locals quickly began to connect the dots, attributing the deaths to the curse that Busby had placed on his chair. But it wasn't until the 20th century that the chair's reputation truly solidified. During World War II, British airmen stationed nearby would visit the inn, and many of them, seeking a thrill, dared each other to sit in the infamous chair. According to the stories, none of the men who sat in the chair came back from the war. They were all killed in action, their deaths hauntingly attributed to Busby's curse. After the war, the curse continued to claim lives. One of the most famous stories involved two bricklayers who, after sitting in the chair during a lunch break, were involved in a fatal car crash on their way back to work. Another man, a roofer, sat in the chair only to fall to his death from a roof just hours later. By the 1970s, the chair had become so notorious that the inn's owner decided it was too dangerous to leave out. Too many people were drawn to it, either out of morbid curiosity or sheer recklessness, and the death toll kept rising. The chair was eventually donated to the Thirsk Museum, where it was hung high on the wall, out of reach, where no one could sit in it ever again. At least, that's what everyone thought. It didn't take long for my curiosity about Busby's stoop chair to turn into an obsession. I spent weeks reading everything I could find about the chair and the deaths associated with it. I devoured books, articles, and old newspaper clippings, piecing together the long and chilling history of the curse. But no amount of research could satisfy the nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I needed to see the chair for myself. I needed to stand in front of it, to feel the weight of the curse in person. Maybe, just maybe, I could figure out whether there was any truth to the legend. And so, I booked a flight to England and made my way to the small market town of Thirsk, nestled in the rolling hills of North Yorkshire. Thirsk was a quiet, picturesque town, far removed from the bustling cities I was used to. It seemed like the last place you'd expect to find an object as cursed as Busby's chair. I arrived at the Thirsk Museum on a cloudy afternoon, the kind of day that felt like it could rain at any moment. The museum itself was small, housed in an old building that had once been part of the local church. It was filled with artifacts from the town's long history, but I barely noticed any of them. I was there for one reason and one reason only: the chair. When I finally found it, hanging high on the wall in the corner of one of the museum's rooms, I felt an immediate sense of unease. The chair looked ordinary enough, just a simple wooden chair, worn with age, with no outward signs of its deadly reputation. But there was something about it, something in the way it sat there, looming over the room, that made my skin crawl. It was hard to believe that something so mundane could carry such a dark and deadly curse. But the longer I stood there, staring up at the chair, the more I felt its presence. It was as if the air around it was heavier, thicker, charged with an invisible energy that I couldn't explain. I wanted to get closer, to inspect the chair more carefully, but there was no way to reach it. The museum had made sure of that. I stood there for what felt like hours, transfixed by the chair, until finally, one of the museum staff approached me. "Quite the story, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the chair. "Busby's curse." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "They say anyone who sits in it is doomed," he continued, lowering his voice as if he were sharing a secret. And after all these years, I'd be inclined to believe it. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the chair. Even after I left the museum and returned to my hotel, the image of the chair hanging on the wall stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. I had come all this way to see it, but just looking at it from a distance hadn't been enough. I needed to know more. I spent the rest of the evening reading through old accounts of the curse, but one detail kept gnawing at me. All the deaths associated with the chair had happened when people sat in it. Now that it was hanging high on the wall, out of reach, the curse seemed to have been neutralized. But what if someone sat in it again? What if the curse was still active, just waiting for its next victim? The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. I knew it was reckless, maybe even suicidal, but part of me wanted to find out what would happen if I sat in the chair. I told myself it was for the sake of research, that I needed to experience it firsthand to truly understand the curse. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was drawn to the chair in a way I couldn't explain, as if it were calling to me, daring me to test its power. I tried to push the thought from my mind, but it wouldn't go away. The next morning, I found myself standing outside the museum again, watching as the staff unlocked the doors for the day. My heart was pounding in my chest as I made my way inside. I knew what I had to do. The museum was quiet that morning, with only a handful of visitors wandering through the exhibits. I made my way back to the room where the chair was displayed, my pulse quickening with every step. When I reached the chair, I stood there for a long time, staring up at it, trying to make up my mind. Was I really going to do this? Was I really going to sit in Busby's cursed chair? The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around and leave, to walk away and forget the whole thing. But the pull of the chair was too strong. I had come this far, and I couldn't turn back now. I waited until the room was empty, then approached one of the museum staff, a young woman in her 20s. She was standing near the entrance, sorting through some brochures. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I was wondering, is there any way I could get a closer look at the chair? She looked at me, puzzled. "You mean Busby's chair?" I nodded. She hesitated, glancing over at the chair. "I'm afraid not. We don't let anyone near it, for obvious reasons." I could feel my heart sinking, but I wasn't ready to give up. "I understand, but I'm actually a researcher," I said, pulling out my notebook. "I'm studying cursed objects, and I've come all the way from the States to see this chair. It's really important for my work." I don't know if it was the sincerity in my voice or just the fact that the museum was nearly empty, but after a moment, she relented. "I can't promise anything," she said, "but I'll ask the manager. Wait here." It felt like an eternity before she returned, accompanied by an older man with a serious expression on his face. He introduced himself as the museum manager and asked me a few questions about my research. I answered as honestly as I could, hoping that he wouldn't see through my thinly veiled excuse for wanting to get close to the chair. After a long pause, he sighed. "Normally, we don't allow this," he said, "but given your situation, I suppose we can make an exception." My heart leapt in my chest. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "We'll bring the chair down for you to examine," the manager said, "but under no circumstances are you to sit in it." "Understood?" I nodded, though the real answer buzzing in my head was far from agreement. It didn't take long for the staff to lower the chair from its perch on the wall. They set it down carefully, as if they were handling something fragile, and then stepped back, leaving me alone with the infamous Busby stoop chair. Up close, the chair looked even more ordinary than it had before. Just a simple wooden chair, with no signs of the curse that had supposedly killed so many people. But as I stood there, staring at it, I felt that same invisible pull, that overwhelming urge to sit in it, to see if the curse was real. I hesitated for a moment, glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I lowered myself into the chair. The wood creaked under my weight, and for a moment, nothing happened. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting for some sign that I had just made a terrible mistake. But the room remained silent, and the only sound was the beating of my own heart in my ears. I sat there for a few minutes, my mind racing. I didn't feel any different. No sudden sense of doom, no feeling of impending death. It was just a chair. After all, maybe the curse was nothing more than a legend, a story blown out of proportion over the centuries. I stood up, my legs shaky, and looked around the room. Still, nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief, convinced that I had just proven the curse was nothing more than superstition. But as I left the museum that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. For the first few days after sitting in the chair, everything seemed normal. I went about my routine, returned to my hotel, and began drafting my research notes. Part of me was still buzzing with the excitement of what I'd done. Sitting in Busby's cursed chair felt like a thrill, like I had tested fate and won. But that sense of victory didn't last long. It started with small, almost imperceptible things. I began feeling unexplainably tired. Even after a full night's sleep, my body felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force. I brushed it off at first, assuming it was just jet lag or the stress of traveling. But deep down, I knew something else was going on. Then, the accident started. A week after I sat in the chair, I was driving home from the grocery store when a car ran a red light and nearly slammed into me. I managed to swerve just in time to avoid a collision, but the experience left me shaken. I tried not to think about the chair, but the thought kept creeping back into my mind. The next day, I tripped while walking down the stairs in my apartment building. I'd been carrying a laundry basket, and as I reached the third step, my foot caught on something, though I couldn't see what, and I went tumbling down. I landed hard on my side, bruising my ribs and nearly breaking my arm. It was starting to become clear that something was very, very wrong. I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. After the second near accident, I knew that the curse was real. I had tempted fate by sitting in Busby's chair, and now I was paying the price. Desperate for answers, I threw myself into researching the curse in more depth. I pored over old records, newspaper clippings, and even obscure folklore books, trying to find a way to undo what I had done. But the more I learned, the more hopeless it seemed. The curse, it appeared, was absolute. Every single person who had sat in Busby's chair had either died or suffered some terrible fate, and there were no stories of anyone who had escaped its grip. The deaths were always sudden, violent, and often completely unexpected. It didn't matter if the person believed in the curse or not. Once they sat in the chair, their fate was sealed. I couldn't believe I had been so reckless. I had ignored the warnings, convinced myself that it was all just a legend, and now I was in the same position as all the others who had tempted the curse. I had to find a way out. As my fear grew, I began to search for anyone who might be able to help me break the curse. I contacted paranormal investigators, psychics, even a historian who specialized in cursed objects, but no one had any real answers. Most of them told me the same thing. The curse was real, and once it had been activated, there was no way to stop it. I refused to accept that. There had to be something I could do, some way to undo the curse before it was too late. Finally, I found someone who offered a glimmer of hope. A local folklore expert, who had studied the history of North Yorkshire's legends, agreed to meet with me. He had heard of the Busby stoop chair and believed that the curse could be tied to unfinished business, something related to Busby's death or the murder he had committed. If the curse is tied to Busby himself, the expert told me, then perhaps resolving whatever keeps his spirit tethered to this world might lift the curse. But it's not guaranteed. You're dealing with something far beyond our understanding. It wasn't much, but it was the only lead I had. Determined to break the curse, I decided to dig deeper into Thomas Busby's life and death. I needed to understand the origins of the curse, why Busby had cursed the chair, and whether there was any way to reverse it. I learned that Busby had been a cruel, violent man, feared by many in the town of Thirsk. His relationship with his father-in-law, Daniel Auti, had been strained for years, and it was no surprise that their arguments often turned violent. But Busby's rage wasn't just about the chair. It was about control, power, and a deep-seated need to dominate those around him. When Busby murdered Auti, it wasn't just an act of passion. It was a calculated move to assert his dominance. The chair, which had been a symbol of Busby's authority in his inn, became the focal point of his curse. By cursing the chair, Busby was ensuring that even in death, his power would continue to affect those who dared challenge him. I realized then that the curse wasn't just about Busby's anger. It was about fear. Busby had lived in fear of losing control, and his curse was a way of maintaining that control, even from beyond the grave. But how could I break that hold? How could I free myself from the curse of a man who had been dead for centuries? Armed with my newfound knowledge, I decided to return to the Thirsk Museum for one final attempt to break the curse. I knew it was risky. I had already tempted fate once by sitting in the chair, but I was running out of time. The accidents were becoming more frequent, and I could feel the curse closing in on me. When I arrived at the museum, I asked to see the chair again. The staff hesitated, but eventually, they agreed, under strict supervision. As I stood in front of the chair, I felt a familiar sense of dread wash over me. This time, though, I wasn't there to sit in it, I was there to confront it. I had read that Busby's last words before his execution had been a curse on anyone who sat in his chair. But what if I could somehow lift that curse? What if I could confront the spirit of Busby himself and release whatever anger or fear was keeping him tied to this world? I spoke aloud, addressing the chair as if I were speaking to Busby himself. I acknowledged his rage, his fear, and his need for control. But I also asked for forgiveness for myself and for all those who had fallen victim to the curse. For a moment, the room was silent, and I felt a strange stillness in the air. It was as if the chair was listening, considering my words. Then, just as suddenly, the stillness lifted, and the room returned to normal. I left the museum that day feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But I wasn't sure if it had worked. Only time would tell. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences in my life gradually subsided. The accident stopped, and I no longer felt the oppressive sense of dread that had haunted me since sitting in the chair. It seemed as though my attempt to lift the curse had worked, or at least, something had changed. I continued my research into Busby's life, but there were still many unanswered questions. Was the curse really broken, or had I simply been lucky? Had my confrontation with the chair somehow appeased Busby's spirit? Or was it all just a coincidence? To this day, I'm not entirely sure. But one thing is clear. I'm no longer haunted by the curse of Busby's stoop chair. Whether it was my words, my actions, or something beyond my understanding, I had escaped the deadly fate that had claimed so many others before me. But even though I've moved on, the chair remains. It still hangs on the wall of the Thirsk Museum, its dark history preserved for all to see. And while I may have survived my encounter with the curse, I know that the next person who dares to sit in that chair might not be so lucky, because some curses never truly die.